The coffee machine hissed behind me, steam curling against my cheek as I wiped down the marble counter for what felt like the 100th time that morning. My fingers were numb from the cold water, my knuckles flushed and stinging, yet I kept scrubbing. The cafe was nearly empty, just two elderly women sipping tea by the window and a middle-aged man hammering away at his laptop. The rush hour had passed long ago, leaving behind the remnants of hurried mornings, crumpled napkins, smudges of lipstick along the rims of abandoned cups, grains of sugar crunching beneath the worn soles of my shoes. I tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, feeling the slickness of oil gathered from standing too close to the espresso machine for too long. The polished steel panel behind it reflected back exactly what I had become. Invisible. Just another girl in a stained apron with dark circles under her eyes, living in the background of other people's lives. The bell over the door chimed. I didn't look up right away. There was nothing left to expect. Just another customer, another order, a few more dollars, almost enough for rent. My manager, Margaret, was in the back counting inventory, which meant I was alone at the counter. I grabbed a clean cup, stepped toward the register, and repeated in my mind the greeting I had used 1,000 times. "Welcome to Maple and Pine Coffee. How can I—" The words froze in my throat. He stood in the doorway and the entire world tilted to one side. The years collapsed inward, folding into a single moment. 7 years compressed inside my chest burst into shards of memory. 7 years spent trying to forget, trying to build walls around the softest parts of my heart, convincing myself that first love was only a foolish illusion meant to be buried forever. Nick Romano. My breath snagged somewhere between my lungs and my throat. He looked different, sharper, harder, as though someone had taken the boy I once loved and carved away every gentle edge, leaving only lines cold enough to be dangerous. His dark brown hair was cut short now, styled neatly, instead of falling in loose morning curls my fingers once knew so well. The leather jacket he wore easily cost more than 3 months of my rent. But those eyes, God, those eyes had not changed. Deep brown, nearly black, burning with the same intensity that once convinced me I was the only soul in the universe whenever he looked at me. And now those eyes locked onto mine across the quiet cafe. I saw something flicker in them. Recognition, and then something deeper I couldn't name. My hand trembled as I set the cup on the counter. It slipped clattering loudly onto the tiled floor, though thankfully it did not break. Heat surged up my neck. I bent to pick it up, grateful for an excuse to hide from that gaze, to gather my breath, to remember how to be a functioning human being. When I rose, he was already close. Too close. He crossed half the cafe in the brief moment I had been crouched down, moving with the controlled ease of a predator. But Nick did not come alone. 2 men walked behind him, dressed in sleek black suits, radiating money and danger. One bore a long scar running from ear to jaw. The other kept his hand near his belt in a way that made my stomach twist. But I couldn't focus on them. All I saw was Nick standing a single arm's length away, looking at me in a way that squeezed my chest tight. Claire. My name in his voice felt like a physical touch. His tone was low, rough, carrying something dangerous beneath the surface. He tilted his head, studying me as if time had not moved. He smiled slightly. He said he had recognized me the moment he walked in. And me, I stood there with my heart pounding so fiercely it threatened to burst while the world seemed to hold its breath. In that instant, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. If you've stayed with me this far, and this story touches something in you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video so we can bring you more heartfelt stories every day. And if it's not too much to ask, tell me where you're watching from. Leave a comment and let us know which corner of the world this story has reached. We treasure every word you share. I remained frozen, unable to move, as though someone had drained all the air from the room. My heart pounded hard enough to hurt each beat, tearing through the 7 years I had spent trying to stitch myself together. That face, that voice. That way he looked at me, as if nothing had changed, as if we had broken up yesterday, as if he had not vanished without a trace, leaving me to drown quietly in emptiness, and unanswered questions. Nick stepped closer. Just one step, but now he was near enough for me to smell his cologne, something familiar layered with something colder, more distant and unsettling. His gaze traveled slowly across my face, settling on my eyes as though searching for something he feared had disappeared. I still couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my head spinning in a blur of confusion, and the simmering anger I had kept locked away. He was the one who finally broke the silence. "Claire, you look exactly the way I remember." I clenched my jaw, trying to steady my voice. "Is that so?" "Because you don't." He nodded once, a faint smile touching his lips without reaching his eyes. "That's true. 7 years is long enough to change a man. But some things stay exactly the same. Like the fact that he didn't ask whether I wanted to see him." Nick ignored my remark or pretended not to hear it. He angled his head slightly, his voice dropping. He just needed 5 minutes. "Only 5 minutes, Claire? You owe him that." I barked out a rough, bitter laugh. "I owe you?" I asked, struggling to contain the anger boiling in my chest. "Do you have any idea what you left behind? A hollow? An obsession? A pile of questions no one could answer." "You can hate me after," he said, his calm maddening. "But give me the chance to let you hate me the right way. Let me stand in front of you instead of being a ghost." The only reason I didn't slap him was because I wasn't sure I would stop at one. I turned away from him, desperate to break the spell of his gaze to keep my breath steady. But my feet felt rooted to the cold tile floor. "How long have you known I worked here?" I asked, not meeting his eyes. "A while," he answered without hesitation. "And you chose today to show up. Why now?" "Because today is the first day I could walk through that door," he said quietly. "If I had come sooner, I wouldn't have been strong enough. And if I had come later, I was afraid it would be too late." Something real hid beneath his composure, something that unsettled me. I glanced at the two men behind him. They remained motionless, but their eyes tracked every shift in his posture. These were not ordinary bodyguards. They were his men. The silent authority around him sent a chill through me. He was no longer the 20-year-old Nick I had loved, and I wasn't sure yet whether that was good or terrible. A customer walked in, shattering the tension. I jolted, stepping back as if waking from a trance. Nick retreated half a step as well, as though realizing how close we had been. I swallowed hard, steadied my breath, and faced him with resolve. "My shift ends at 5. If you're still here, I'll listen, but only 5 minutes, not a second more." He nodded, and for the first time since he had walked in, something softened in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Then he stepped back and moved to an empty table in the corner, a place where he could see everything, yet remain out of sight. I stood still, watching him disappear behind the counter's edge. My heart kept racing, my mind filling with questions I had buried long ago. 7 years. And he returned as if he had never left. I didn't know whether I had agreed out of anger, curiosity, or the betrayal of my own heart when he said my name. But one thing was clear. My life had shifted the moment he walked in. I poured coffee for the new customer with one hand while the other tried to stay steady. The rich aroma rose around me, but my thoughts were pulled irresistibly toward the corner table where Nick sat, as silent and certain as a shadow. He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped before him, eyes never leaving me. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone overturned everything inside me. How long had it been since I last heard my name in that voice? How long since I last held him, slept in his arms, believing the world could not touch us? I still remembered the last day we spent together, that autumn afternoon, when golden leaves fell through the park, and Nick promised to call when he got home. He never called. One day passed, then two, then a week. I called him, texted him, went to his apartment. Empty. Every trace of Nick Romano vanished from the city as though he had never existed. His friends stayed silent. Every place he frequented shook their heads. The police had no reports, not a note, not a reason. Just me, a 20-year-old girl with a shattered heart who couldn't sleep and dreamed of him every night. Each morning I had to remind myself that he was gone and that my not knowing why did not make me weak, only angry. And now he sat there, in an expensive leather jacket, the once gentle eyes now sharpened by authority and something darker. He watched me as though he had never abandoned me. I carried a tray of water and coffee to another table, trying not to look his way and failing. My fingers trembled as I set the cups down. The customer thanked me and I nodded, walking away quickly. But when I passed Nick's table, I stopped, my feet refusing to carry me another step, even as my heart rioted in my chest. He looked up, waiting. I leaned forward, both hands pressed against the dark wooden table, staring directly into his eyes. "You shouldn't be here." My voice was low but firm. He tilted his head slightly, saying nothing for a moment. His gaze didn't waver, still calm, still carrying that unnerving sense of ownership, as though this place belonged to him. "Are you saying that because you're angry? Or because you're afraid I froze?" He still knew exactly how to disarm me. Still knew the moment to push me toward the edge. I stepped back, my hands clenching. "I'm saying it because I don't need you disrupting my life again. It took me 7 years to stand on my own. You don't get to walk in here, look at me like that, and pretend nothing happened." My voice trembled, not from weakness, but from holding back the storm gathering inside me. Nick didn't get angry. In fact, he smiled, a faint, elusive curve of the lips I couldn't decipher as mockery or regret. If I could erase those 7 years, Claire, I would. But I can't. And I didn't come here to beg for forgiveness. I came for the chance to speak. I studied him, searching for the boy I once loved inside the man before me. Something in his eyes kept me from turning away. Not softness, not nostalgia, but the need to understand, to finally know why someone who had loved me so fiercely could disappear as though he had never breathed beside me. I stepped back, drew a long breath and walked away, leaving him behind like a piece of the past rising from the grave but not yet absolved. Even with my back turned, I felt his gaze follow me. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I had thought that after my firm words, Nick would retreat, or at least fall silent long enough to reflect on what his presence meant to me now. But he stayed exactly where he was, calm and unshaken, with the steadiness of someone too accustomed to waiting for whatever he intended to have. I returned to the counter, my mind a tangled mess. The next few hours passed with a slow cruelty. I made coffee, wiped tables, filled orders. Yet every thought curved back toward the man sitting in the corner, with a quiet patience that made my nerves coil tight. He watched me without blinking, as though if I vanished from his sight for even a heartbeat, the years he had spent searching would collapse into nothing. Each time I walked past him, Nick said nothing. He simply observed and every now and then glanced at his watch, as if reminding me that the promise of 5 minutes still waited to be honored. At last, when the clock neared 3 in the afternoon, the cafe was empty enough that I could breathe. Margaret disappeared into the back to handle paperwork, leaving me alone at the front. I wiped my hands on my apron, hesitated for a moment, then walked toward Nick's table. He lifted his gaze when he saw me approach but did not speak. I stood straight, keeping a careful distance. "If you are still here at closing time, I will listen to you. But only if you understand one thing." I began, my voice low and steady. "This is my life. A small coffee shop, a rented apartment, an old cat, and no one has the right to step into it unless I allow them. I don't want people watching me. I don't want to be followed. I don't want late-night calls or sudden visits at my door. Do you understand?" Nick looked at me for a moment, calculating. He didn't reach for his phone. Instead, he made a subtle, almost imperceptible signal with his hand to the man with the scar standing near the door. The bodyguard moved instantly. He walked to the entrance, flipped the sign to closed, and locked the door with a sharp click that echoed in the silence. Margaret rushed out from the back, her face flushed with confusion, but before she could speak, the second man stepped forward and handed her a thick envelope. He whispered something low in her ear that made her eyes widen not with delight, but with a sudden instinctual fear. She nodded quickly, grabbed her coat, and signaled the other staff to leave immediately. Within 60 seconds, the bustling cafe was dead silent. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice rising. Nick remained seated, his expression unreadable. "I can't sit in a public window for 5 hours, Claire. It's a security risk for me and now for you. If I am to wait, I control the environment." He looked around the empty room as if he owned the very air inside it. "The shop is closed. Everyone has been compensated for a week's wages. Now it's just us." I narrowed my eyes. "You just said you wouldn't interfere." "This is not interference," he replied quietly. "This is arranging things so we can have 5 minutes without being interrupted. If after those 5 minutes you want me gone again, I will leave." I crossed my arms and stepped back slightly, feeling as if I had been pulled into a game where I wasn't sure the rules belonged to me. "How long have you been looking for me?" I asked. 7 years, he answered without blinking. "I went through nearly 10 cities, 2 continents. Sometimes I thought I had the wrong woman. Sometimes I almost gave up. But in the end, I knew that as long as I was breathing, I had to find you." I didn't know how much of his words I believed, but something in his voice softened a dangerous place inside me. I remembered the way we had once loved each other. Fiercely, foolishly, recklessly. The summers spent tangled together in that cramped apartment, eating instant noodles and dreaming about what might come next. The nights he carried me across the street after my late shifts. The evenings he strummed his guitar while I sketched in my notebook, both of us laughing, because neither of us had an ounce of real talent, yet somehow everything felt beautiful. Could that love die? I had once thought so. But when I looked into his eyes now, I wasn't sure anymore. Nick leaned back slightly, his gaze still fixed on me. He didn't force me to sit, didn't reach out to touch me. He simply waited. And that unsettled me more than anything. The man who once knew how to shake my world apart was choosing silence, to ask for a chance. I drew a deep breath and walked back to the counter. I didn't agree, I didn't refuse. He would have to wait until 8, and I would listen. But only for 5 minutes, no more. And only if he kept his word. I didn't know whether what I was doing was right or wrong. All I knew was that my heart had never fully stopped beating for the name Nick Romano. And tonight might be the last time I allowed it to beat for him again. When the minute hand passed 8, I stood behind the counter with my hand resting on the coffee pot, though my mind had long abandoned any intention of continuing the nightly cleanup. The cafe had been empty of customers for hours, and the staff had gone home. The room glowed with soft golden light, quiet enough that I could hear the steady ticking of the wall clock, as though it were inside my own chest. Nick still sat where he had been all day in the corner, unmoving, as if he had merged with the old wooden patterns of the cafe itself. I dried my hands, took a long breath, and walked toward him, pulling out the chair opposite him. My heartbeat thundered, though I kept my expression steady. 5 minutes, I reminded. He nodded, neither smiling nor speaking right away. He watched me for a few seconds, then tilted his head slightly. "The way you drink coffee hasn't changed," he said softly, as though it were the most important detail in the world. "You always add a touch of milk, stir 2.5 times, then place the spoon on the saucer instead of in the cup." I blinked, feeling my throat tighten. 7 years had passed, and he still remembered something so small. I curled my fingers in my lap, reminding myself not to be swayed by sentiment. "Speak," I whispered. "Tell me why you disappeared." He nodded, his gaze sinking into a darkness like deep water at midnight. "My father was killed right after the last time we saw each other. An ambush on his way home. No one warned him. His car exploded beneath a bridge on the south side of the city." I stared at him in shock. I had never seen anything like that in the news. He seemed to read my thoughts. It wasn't in the papers because he wasn't an ordinary businessman. He was the head of a branch of the Romano organization, and his death was the beginning of a silent war. I leaned back, a chill rippling through me. So that means... He nodded. I became the heir. After my father's death, I had to take control to protect the rest of my family. My mother was sent into hiding my younger brother to Italy, and I had to vanish from the world you knew, because if I had contacted you, you would have been placed on a list of people to eliminate. I didn't know what I was hearing anymore. My mind felt like it was splintering. For years I had imagined 1,000 reasons. He cheated. He grew tired of me. He had an accident. But never this. I studied him carefully. His face, his posture, they were still Nick. But he was no longer the young man who laughed in the kitchen on Sunday mornings or wrote my name in chocolate on top of desserts. Who are you now? I asked, the tremor in my voice impossible to hide. He didn't answer right away. He simply looked at me deeply and spoke slowly. I am a man who had to learn to command instead of beg. A man who can make an entire organization stop with a single nod. But I am also the man who sat 5 hours in a small cafe just to see you again. I turned my face away, my chest tightening. My emotions blurred until I could no longer name them. I wanted to run. I wanted to hold him. I wanted to scream. I wanted silence. And the worst part was that deep down inside, his presence made my heart feel alive again. I still hadn't spoken when he continued. He knew he had no right to ask for forgiveness. But he had searched for me for 7 years, not to apologize, but to tell the truth. And now he had. He waited unblinking. I didn't know how to respond. I only knew that in that moment I could not rise from the table and walk away as I had imagined. I could only sit there, caught in the storm that had emptied itself into my chest, with a cup of cold coffee before me and the gaze of a man who had changed everything I once believed I knew. I didn't remember how long I sat in silence after Nick finished speaking. The world seemed to freeze around us. Outside the window, night had fallen completely, and the dim streetlights cast a soft, sorrowful glow over his face. I looked at those eyes, the ones that once made me feel the safest, now the ones that left me breathless with uncertainty. He had not lied. I knew it in some unexplainable way. Every piece of his story aligned with the empty spaces that had haunted me for 7 long years. Yet the truth did not soothe me. It weighed heavier than any lie I had ever imagined. I gripped the edge of my chair, steadying my voice. So now you've told me everything. I looked at him directly. Now it's my turn. He nodded as though he had expected this. I cannot pretend you never existed, nor can I deny that you were once too important to be erased. But I am not the girl I used to be. I learned how to live alone, how to rebuild from the rubble. I have a job, a rhythm to my days. Boundaries I fought hard to create. If you truly want to try again, I won't forbid it. But it must be under my conditions. 1 month. I spoke each word clearly. We try for 1 month. No obligations, no pressure, no interference in my life. I will still work here. I will still live in my old apartment. You will not place people around me. You will not adjust my safety unless I ask. No drivers, no gifts, no control. We see each other when I choose. Even texting must respect distance. If I feel suffocated even once I walk away, forever. He fell quiet, his gaze tightening slightly. Clearly those terms clashed with every instinct carved into him by years of surviving a violent world. He was used to commanding, not waiting. But I did not back down, not this time. I needed to know that if I walked toward him again, it would be my choice, not the pull of someone orchestrating things behind the scenes. 1 month was all I could give. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though each movement went against something deeply rooted. 1 month, he repeated, and I will not cross a single line unless you allow it. He sat there with quiet eyes, and a voice softened into something almost fragile, no longer the powerful man who spoke of death and vengeance, but the man I once loved, desperate to find his way back to the heart he lost. I rose, grabbed my coat, and did not look at him again. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped out into the thin, early winter night. The cold brushed my neck, making me shiver. I knew he was watching from inside, his gaze heavy with unspoken fear and hope, but I didn't turn around. I needed distance, time, certainty. I needed to know I was no longer the 20-year-old girl who loved Nick Romano more than she loved herself. If I ever chose to love him again, it would be because I walked toward him freely, not pushed, not pulled, and certainly not led. I woke the next morning to find my phone glowing with a message from Nick. "Good morning, Claire. If you still like the strawberry cheesecake waffles you used to love, there's a box waiting by the cafe door." I sat up, stared at the screen for a few seconds, then let out a slow, quiet breath. I didn't reply. But when I arrived at the cafe, the box was truly there, along with a handwritten note in the familiar script that once felt like home. There was no one waiting outside, no suspicious figure lingering in the shadows. Everything was exactly as I had asked. No control, no presence, just a small gesture. And somehow that smallness was what unsettled me most. The first 3 days passed under a veil of caution. Each morning he sent a simple greeting, sometimes accompanied by a photo of a cup of coffee with a note. "It's raining today. Don't forget your coat." Sometimes it was an unexpected question. "Do you still have the handkerchief I gave you the first time?" I didn't answer a single message during those days. Not out of anger, but because I didn't yet understand what I was feeling. He was trying, I knew that. But was it sincerity? Or the subtle manipulation of someone who had learned perhaps too well the art of influence? I still went to work as usual, still returned to my apartment alone, still sketched aimlessly in my old notebook. But in my mind, there was always a small, steady space where his name lingered like breath. On the 5th day, I received another message. He said he had visited the art exhibit I once mentioned years ago. There was a painting that reminded him of me. "You used to draw curves like this, soft and dreamlike." Beneath the text was a photo of an oil painting in cool tones showing a woman with her back turned, standing in a field of pale wind-brushed reeds. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't know whether I was moved or afraid. I had always believed I was the only one who remembered the small things from our old life. But Nick was proving the opposite. Every message, every image, every fragment of memory he pulled from the past struck precisely at the part of me I had hidden deepest. I began to split in two. One part felt comforted, understood. The other remained wary. It had taken me 7 years to learn how to love myself after he left. I wasn't willing to surrender that for a handful of gentle texts. And yet, those gentle texts were something I hadn't received from anyone else in all those years. On the 7th night, another message came. No picture, no memory, just one quiet line. "I'm still here, not crossing any lines, not stepping forward unless you call. But I'm here." I set the phone down and wondered which direction my heart was beginning to lean. I didn't reply. I still had time. But for the first time since we reunited, I woke each morning expecting something. A message, a cup of coffee, an old memory returning like a whisper, reminding me I had once been loved, and maybe in some hard-to-believe way still was. On the 8th morning, after a week of gentle distance, I received his first invitation. He asked if I wanted to have dinner over the weekend at an Italian restaurant called La Notte. He added that the place was quiet, warmly lit, and the tiramisu could make anyone forgive even the greatest mistakes. I read the message several times. There was a familiar playfulness in it, a part of him that once made me laugh too loudly in my 20s, but I was not that easily softened anymore. I replied that I would go, but only with one condition. Public place. No private car, no secluded location, none of his world. Nick replied with a single word. "Understood." I arrived at La Notte at 7 wearing a simple black dress and my old flat shoes. The restaurant sat on a quiet corner in River North, its entrance framed by vines and soft amber lights like melted honey. The server knew my name and guided me past murmured conversations and the scent of warm garlic to a private corner screened by white lace curtains. Nick was already seated, sleeves rolled, his tie loose, his hair slightly tousled as if he'd just stepped out of the wind, his eyes brightening the moment he saw me. I sat without speaking. He didn't rush. He poured water, placed the menu before me. He told me the restaurant had opened 4 years earlier, a gift for his mother before she passed. She had dreamed of a place like this where people could dine under warm lights, listen to old Italian songs, and call each other by their true names. I listened silently, not asking questions, though my gaze didn't miss the two large men seated a few tables away, glancing toward us now and then. Bodyguards. He had never truly left that world. He knew I noticed. He didn't deny it or make excuses. He simply said softly that they were there not to watch me but to keep us safe. Everyone in the city knew he had re-emerged and that I was seen beside him. I touched the rim of my glass, my fingers circling it as a way to keep myself steady. Everything here felt too perfect, too calm, like an old painting beautiful enough to feel unreal. "Who are you now?" I asked, keeping my voice even as the server brought our plates. Neither of us touched the food. Nick looked at me, his gaze steady and unflinching. "I am the man who once loved you madly, and still does." I didn't answer right away. His words washed over me like a wave. I wanted to believe them, but I was afraid too. Afraid that behind such tenderness was a world where I could never survive. I took a long breath and looked around the candlelit room with its soft music. A part of me wanted to stand up and leave to safeguard the fragile balance I had built. But another part of me wanted to stay, just to listen a little longer, to see a little deeper into the man I had once loved, with every reckless beat of my heart, now trying to walk slowly back toward me. Dinner continued in a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable. When dessert arrived, Nick pushed the tiramisu toward me. He said he remembered how I always ate the cream first, the opposite of everyone else. I didn't laugh, but the corner of my mouth lifted. Some memories sleep softly until someone touches them. When I stood to leave, he didn't reach for my hand. He only whispered, "Thank you for coming." He looked at me as if just one more return from me would be enough for him to wait a lifetime. And I stepped out of La Notte carrying the faint sweetness of dessert in the air and one haunting sentence replaying in my mind. "I am the man who once loved you madly, and still does." When I walked out of La Notte, the night wind brushed my cheek cool, but not enough to extinguish the burning in my chest. His final words echoed in my mind, each syllable seeping through the walls I had built for 7 years. I had thought I could simply turn away, but everything seemed to tangle me up even more. We didn't see each other for the next few days. Nick didn't text, didn't call, keeping his promise not to cross any boundary unless I opened it first. But it was that silence that left me most unsteady. I began to miss him. Not the man he had become, but the past that had never been explained. I needed an answer. So that evening after my shift, I sent him a message. He arrived within 15 minutes. No bodyguards, just a dark coat and eyes that looked as though he had been waiting for that message for a very long time. We sat in another small cafe where no one knew us, no one cared to look. I didn't circle around my question. Why, I asked. Why didn't you leave even one message? One call, one text, anything. He was silent for a long moment, choosing each word with care. When his father was killed, the organization collapsed within hours. He was hunted, not by one branch, but by 5 in a single night. Nick's voice was steady without drama. They didn't just want power. They wanted to erase the Romano bloodline. His mother, his younger brother, and of course, the one person he had ever said the word love to. I stiffened. Me. He had never spoken to anyone about me, but he knew that the moment he left even the faintest trace, I would become the first target. He had to disappear completely. No trace, no emotion, no contact. He left with a backpack and the first gun he ever had to use. I stared at him, unsure what shocked me more, the coldness of his tone, or the fact that he spoke as though he had survived a war I never knew existed. He went on. He drifted through Arizona, then Mexico. Once he nearly died in Sonora. Once he was betrayed by someone he had called uncle. There was a night he slept in an abandoned car with my picture in his hand, gripping it, as if it were a lifeline. I froze. A picture. He nodded and pulled his wallet from his coat. The leather was worn, and from inside he drew a small photograph. Its edges curled, its ink faded with time. It was me smiling into the sun wind in my hair, wearing the oversized white shirt I had once borrowed from him the night he first slept over. He had carried that picture with him for 7 years. Through the running, the gunfights, the moments he nearly died. He never threw it away because it was the only thing that made him feel human. I couldn't speak. My throat tightened, my heart pounding wildly. I didn't know whether I wanted to hold him or run from him. There was something in his eyes that warmed me and frightened me all at once. He was no longer the young man I had loved. He was someone who had walked through hell, carrying me in every step. I turned toward the window, watching the darkness outside, car lights streaking by like old memories. Everything in my head was in disarray. But somewhere deep inside, for the first time in many years, I felt something other than anger. I felt sorrow, and tenderness, and a loneliness that sank right through me. On Saturday morning, I received a short message from Nick. Nothing ornate, nothing meant to soften me. If you're ready, I'd like to invite you to my home. Just a quiet afternoon. No pressure. I didn't answer right away, but for the rest of the morning my heart couldn't settle. Curiosity, caution, and a longing I didn't want to acknowledge pulled at me all at once, a desire to see the world he had lived in for 7 years. The world that had shaped him into a man I still wasn't sure I should trust or fear. Eventually, I replied that I would come. A black car arrived at exactly 2 in the afternoon, the driver in a black suit, polite and utterly silent. I sat in the back watching the familiar city blocks fade as the car turned toward the northern outskirts where rows of autumn maples cast long shadows over the stone-paved road. The iron gates opened slowly, revealing a sprawling estate, the mansion set deep within manicured gardens, framed by sculpted hedges, an old fountain, and silent stone statues. The house held the elegance of old Europe, as if lifted from a classic film scene, every detail polished into a beauty so precise it felt unsettling. Inside, I was struck by the soaring ceilings, the soft light from enormous windows, the faint hum of classical music drifting from hidden speakers. Strangely, all that beauty felt cold. Everything was too quiet, too orderly, too empty, as if the house were only a shell built to contain a soul that never fully lived in it. Nick appeared at the top of the staircase, wearing a cream-colored shirt without a tie, his features gentler than usual, though his eyes remained as sharp as ever. He didn't rush toward me, didn't reach out. He simply looked at me and offered a small nod. He led me through the rooms, introducing each space in brief. The library, the dining room, the living room, with its marble fireplace, and a large portrait of his mother hung prominently on the wall. But it was the final room upstairs that made my heart stop. Nick's office, not large but powerful in its quiet authority. A solid oak desk, tall shelves reaching up to the ceiling, the warm glow of a desk lamp casting deliberate light across each item. And then I saw it. A small photo frame on the bookshelf, not placed in the center, not displayed like a proud memento, but tucked behind a few leather-bound journals. I stepped closer. It was an old photograph of us during the picnic near Lake Michigan, me laughing with my eyes scrunched shut, my hand tugging playfully on his shirt while he looked at me as if the world began and ended in that smile. I turned to Nick, trying to steady my voice. "Why do you still keep this?" He came to stand beside me, not touching me, only meeting my eyes. Because I never forgot. Not one day, not one moment. I didn't know how to respond. For a brief instant, all the anger, hurt, and doubt I had carried for years seemed to soften. Time had worn both of us down, but that photograph, that look in his eyes, that quiet presence hidden in a cold and quiet room, whispered that some things never truly leave. And standing there within the world of Nick Romano, a world built on power and silence, I realized for the first time that he had never really let me go, not even for a single day. I stayed at the estate until nearly 9 that night, partly out of courtesy, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I still hadn't recovered from seeing that photograph in his office. Nick didn't ask me to stay the night. He simply told the driver to be ready whenever I wished to leave. I wandered alone through the garden, following the winding stone path past the vineyard and the lavender bushes already fading in the glow of the garden lights. The air was cool and still, as if the world outside the estate had been shut out by its tall walls. When I returned to the west corridor, the one leading toward Nick's private work wing, I intended to find him to say goodnight. Instead, I heard Vincent's voice through a partially closed door. His tone was nothing like the calm, respectful manner he'd shown earlier. It was sharp, angry. "You are making a mistake, Nick. She is your weakness. We spent years rebuilding power, securing trust from the remaining factions. And now, you bring her back in the middle of rising tension." I held my breath. Inside, footsteps shifted, followed by Nick's voice, steady and firm. "Claire is not a political tool. She is the woman I love." Vincent's next words were edged with frustration. "And that is exactly why she is dangerous. People are watching every move you make. They don't need an excuse to act. They only need to sense you're vulnerable." Nick responded slowly, each word weighed down by something heavy. "I know. But I will not lose her again. Not again." My chest tightened. The door closed fully, muffling their voices. I didn't know how long I stood there before Nick opened the door and found me in the hallway. He paused, and for a moment we only looked at each other. I broke the silence first. "I heard by accident." He exhaled, his eyes darkening. "I wasn't trying to hide it from you, Claire. It just wasn't time yet. You are my weakness, and you know that." I nodded. "I do. But I want to hear it from you." Nick stepped closer, still not touching me. "You make me vulnerable. When you walk into a room, I'm no longer the man people fear. I'm the man who is afraid of losing you. You are the only thing in this world that makes me feel not invincible." I tightened my hands, meeting his gaze. "And does that scare you?" Nick shook his head. "No. It makes me feel human. And I forgot that feeling long ago." I didn't know whether to be moved or terrified. Part of me felt my heart tremble at the honesty in his words. Another part screamed with fear. I didn't belong to a world of whispered threats and shadowed alliances. And yet I couldn't deny that standing before him, I had never felt more real. He took one slow step toward me, then gently touched my wrist. "Claire, if you want to leave, I won't stop you. But if you stay, I will protect you with my last breath, even if the whole world turns against me." I didn't answer. 100 questions roared through my mind. But one thing was certain. I wasn't ready to walk away. Even with the fear and confusion twisting inside me, I wanted to understand him more. I wanted to see beyond the layers he had built over 7 years, not to forgive, but to know whether there was still something true beneath all that darkness. Nick said nothing after my final words, only nodded and walked toward the end of the corridor, gesturing for me to follow. I hesitated for a moment before my feet moved on their own. There was something in his eyes, something that felt like he wanted to open a door he had kept closed for too long, and I couldn't turn away. We stopped before a heavy metal door in the basement, locked with a fingerprint scanner and a code panel. Nick entered the numbers, pressed his thumb to the screen, and the door opened slowly, revealing a room utterly unlike the elegant estate above. There were no windows. Soft white lights glowed from dozens of recessed bulbs across the ceiling. A massive wall of computer monitors stretched from end to end, displaying digital maps of the city marked with blinking red and blue points, data charts, surveillance videos, and network diagrams. At the center stood a large glass-topped table covered with electronic equipment, headphones, hard drives, recordings, and documents. The air was cold and dense, like a miniature command center hidden beneath the earth. I stepped inside, my breath catching as my footsteps echoed faintly on the floor, as if the room itself listened to every sound. Nick stood beside me, hands in his pockets, his voice low and steady. "This is the coordination center. Every piece of information from the groups comes through here. Financial activity, transport routes, alliances, threats." He didn't look at me. He knew I was overwhelmed. I looked toward the pinned photographs on the far board, faces, numbers, coded labels. Some were people I recognized from the news, businessmen, politicians, artists, admired by the public, yet somehow woven into Nick's network. "You're looking at the real world, Claire. There is no darkness, only power and equilibrium. What the public sees is just the surface." I swallowed hard, feeling as if I were slipping into a dream with no clear exit. "This is why you stayed silent for 7 years. This is what you fought to protect," I whispered, realizing my voice trembled. Nick nodded, his eyes unblinking. He didn't defend himself, didn't try to soften any truth. He stood there with a cold kind of honesty, as if telling me that if I wanted to run, now was the time. I turned to him, the words leaving my lips before I could think. "Have you ever killed anyone?" Without hesitation, Nick answered. "I gave orders, and I take responsibility." I gasped softly. His answer wasn't a boast nor a confession laced with regret. It was simply the truth delivered without theatrics, which somehow made it more frightening. He didn't deny, and he didn't justify. I stepped back, my legs unsteady. Nick watched me, his voice gentler, almost pleading. "You can walk out of here right now. But if you stay, I won't hide anything from you again. This is who I am. Not the man you remember, not the memory you loved. This is my present. This is what I've become." I stood in silence, my eyes still locked on the flickering maps across the room. My mind raced with images of two men, the one who used to brew coffee for me every morning, who held me close when I whispered in my sleep, and the one now running an unseen empire from this cold underground room. But I didn't run. Even as my heart pounded and my hands chilled with fear, I stayed. Because in his eyes, beneath the steel and shadows, I still saw the boy who kissed me for the first time by the pier, the boy who slipped a flower into the book I loved just to make me smile. And I knew that only by facing this truth could I understand whether I still loved him at all. I left the estate late at night, the thin mist clinging to the car windows like the last traces of a conversation I knew I would never forget, especially the one buried deep beneath the house. I didn't say goodbye. I only looked at Nick one final time as the driver opened the door. He didn't try to stop me, didn't reach out, didn't plead. He simply stood there in the dim light of the hallway, his eyes filled with a sorrow too quiet to name. On the drive home, I couldn't remember what I thought about. My mind drifted through a blur of overlapping images, flickering screens, shifting networks, and his cold, precise words that cut like a blade. He gave orders. And he took responsibility. It felt as if an invisible hand were tightening around my chest, making each breath short and incomplete. When I reached my small apartment, I turned off my phone. For 3 days, I didn't read a single message. But they still came. Not persistent, not demanding. Just a few brief lines. "Claire, did you get home safely? It's cold today. Remember to wear something warm. I know you need time. I'll wait." He wasn't trying to sway me yet. Those quiet messages unsettled me even more. I had seen his real world. It was no longer whispers or shadows or the unease that used to linger around the edges of my imagination. I had stood inside that room among decisions weighted with blood and the faces mapped into his web of power. And now I no longer knew if I could love a man like that. But what kept me awake at night wasn't fear. It was the look in his eyes when he said with a desperation that stripped him of every mask that he had done everything just to find me. That sentence hit me like a heartbeat, skipping a measure, echoing inside me without end. I imagined him crossing unfamiliar landscapes carrying that faded photograph, surviving in a world where death was never more than one breath away, hoping one day he would see me again. I wondered what it meant for someone to guard a love for 7 years, as if it were a sacred secret, while I had spent those same years trying to bury it, pretending it had never existed. 3 days without seeing him, and yet I felt his presence in every silence in every moment. My hand drifted unconsciously to my chest, where my heartbeat stumbled. Each night I lay staring at the ceiling, my heart a maze with no exit. I was no longer angry, but I was afraid. I didn't know whether the thread between us was love or addiction, instinct or fate. I remembered his eyes when I turned away near the basement stairs. No regret, no pleading, only a quiet waiting, as if he understood that I would return when I was ready, or I would walk away forever if I couldn't accept the truth of who he had become. But what clawed at me most was the realization that I couldn't sever him. Not even after seeing everything, not even knowing how far he had gone from the young man I once loved at 20. Because in the deepest corner of my heart, I knew I had never truly stopped loving him. And that was the most terrifying truth of all. Rain began to fall near the end of my shift, heavy drops beating against the awning, and the cafe windows carrying a bitter chill that seeped through my thin sweater and made me shiver. The shop was almost fully cleaned, the faint scent of dark coffee and pastries still lingering in the air. The muted yellow lights reflecting across the wooden floor dampened by rainwater carried in on customers' shoes. I was wiping down the last table when the bell over the door chimed. My heart clenched. A part of me already knew who it was. Nick stood there soaked through in a dark overcoat, rain dripping from his hair onto his strong, unyielding features. For a moment he said nothing, only looked at me as though searching for something in my eyes that even he was afraid to name. I tightened my grip on the towel in my hand, unsure whether to turn away or stay still. Then he stepped further inside, his voice low and rough with cold, and something deeper than loneliness. He didn't command, didn't explain. He spoke only one sentence: "Teach me how to love you without making you afraid." I couldn't react. Every wall I had built, every piece of anger, every fear I'd held for 7 years, collapsed beneath a wave, without shape, leaving me staring at a man trembling, not from cold, but from a love he didn't know how to hold. I began to cry as if everything I'd been keeping inside those past few days had been waiting for this precise moment to break. Nick stepped closer, slowly, carefully, not touching me, not adding another word. I nodded and gestured for him to sit at the table by the window. I locked the door, flipped the sign to closed, and quietly brought out 2 cups of hot tea instead of coffee. We sat facing each other, listening to the rain striking the glass, our breaths fogging softly in the damp air. It had been so long since I'd seen his eyes, without the armor, without the pride, or the shadow of power. All that remained was a man trying to relearn how to love without wounding the person he loved most. We talked about everything: old memories, unanswered questions, unnamed hurts and wounds he had never spoken aloud. He told me about the sleepless nights in Rio, the near death, escapes, the betrayals, the nights he sat gripping a gun while holding my photograph in his other hand, because thinking of me was the only thing that kept him from lowering it against his own head. I told him about the emptiness I had carried the mornings I stared at myself in the mirror, not knowing what I was living for. He said he knew he couldn't ask me to accept everything, and he didn't dare ask me to forgive him. All he wanted was one chance to become someone I didn't have to run from. I held his hand when the clock neared 3 in the morning. His palm was ice cold, but for the first time it no longer shook. For the first time I saw Nick Romano not as a man behind power and orders and shadows, but as someone trying, truly trying to do right by a heart he had never learned how to protect. And even though I didn't know what waited ahead, I understood this much: the moment I didn't turn away was the beginning of a new chapter, where 2 people who had lost each other in the dark were learning to find one another again, slowly gently in the quiet rhythm of a night filled with falling rain. That weekend, I decided to go to Nick's home again, not to test him, not to judge him, but to see if we could rebuild something from the fragments that 7 years apart had left behind. When I stepped through the main gate, the warm light from the living room spilled onto the porch like a soft welcome. Nick stood there wearing the smile that had never truly faded, though now made fragile by hope and uncertainty. He opened the door and the space inside felt both familiar and new, still decorated with the classic details he loved, softened now by touches of modern warmth. We sat together on the sofa, hand in hand, talking about old memories, about afternoons spent wandering by the lake without caring about time. Nick told me about his mother, an artist who had inspired him with her vibrant paintings, her faces and landscapes he still carried in his heart. I felt as if I could see her through his stories, as if I were glimpsing the gentle world that had shaped him long before the shadows ever touched him. We moved to the kitchen where the scent of garlic and basil mingled with the last hints of morning coffee, and we began preparing lunch. He chopped vegetables. I mixed the salad, and our hands brushed over and over in small, quiet moments that needed no explanation, each touch both steadying and breathless. We laughed, sharing small stories about our lives, the things that had changed, the things that stayed the same. He told me of the battles fought in the dark, the isolation he had never been able to speak of. I told him about the cafe, the customers, and the quiet joy of teaching a child how to draw. Each story drew us closer, softening the distance that 7 years had carved. We tried cooking pasta together, our hands meeting at the stove as we stirred the sauce, and my heartbeat felt as though it had slipped into the same rhythm as his. Those tender, ordinary moments, so small yet so weighted, made me realize that closeness didn't require power or money, only the honest presence of two people trying. The afternoon passed with sunlight streaming through the windows, touching the paintings he kept on the walls, reminding me of art of his mother, and of the man he truly was beneath everything else, not the kingpin or the dangerous figure, but the man who had loved me, still loved me, and whom I had chosen to stay beside to feel that truth. By the time dusk settled, we sat together in silence, our hands still intertwined, hearts, both peaceful and aching, with all that had been lost. For the first time in years, I felt we could truly begin again, not quickly, not under pressure, but as two souls mending distance with each shared story, each quiet gesture, each fragile smile. I realized that our love had not been erased by time. It had simply been waiting, patient and wounded, ready to breathe again slowly, one careful step at a time, in this home filled with light and memory. The next morning, while I was arranging the paintings we had hung in the living room, my phone buzzed, not a message, but a direct notification from an encrypted number. I picked it up, and the blood drained from my face. It wasn't just a picture. It was a photograph taken through the rain-streaked window of the cafe that night. The angle was distant, taken from a rooftop across the street, bypassing all of Nick's guards. It showed Nick holding my hand, his face unguarded. Beneath the photo, there was no news caption, only 3 words sent directly to me: found his weakness. My phone slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the floor. Nick appeared instantly, his instincts sharp. He saw my pale face, looked down at the screen, and his expression shattered. The calm, collected mask he had worn for 7 years cracked into pure, terrified rage. He didn't just see a leak, he saw a failure. Despite buying the cafe, despite the lockdown, despite the bodyguards, someone had been watching us the entire time. He didn't speak at first, only looked at me with everything unsaid. The air felt heavy, each second stretching. Then he pointed at me and said I would not leave the house alone anymore, that he had to ensure my safety. I stepped back, anger flaring hot and sharp, my voice trembling but unwavering. I wasn't a doll to be locked away. I had the right to choose and to protect myself. He looked at me, his voice dropping, still furious but restrained, as he reminded me of the forces outside, of how one small mistake could put me in real danger. I took a deep breath, trying to hold steady, but my anger rose again. If he didn't trust me enough to stand beside him, to fight with him, I would walk out now. Nick moved closer, his hands gripping my shoulders gently but firmly, his voice low and weighted with power and desperation as he tried to make me understand that everything he did was to protect me, that his fear of losing me was stronger than anything else. I stepped back again, my eyes meeting his, in a challenge love was not the same as captivity. I could not live in fear, and I needed to be respected as an adult who could make her own decisions. We argued, our voices echoing through the open room, a storm of anger and worry and love and fear. Nick spoke of his enemies, the danger stirred by my picture, and the information now exposed the people who would use me to hurt him or break him. I argued back, insisting I wasn't an object to hide away, that I had the right to stand beside him, not behind locked doors. He fell silent, his gaze fixed on me, pained but resolute, before saying he couldn't allow me to risk myself. I drew a deep breath and said again clearly, if he didn't believe in my strength enough to let me face the world with him, then I couldn't stay. The space between us stretched tight, heavy with truth, and a challenge neither of us could ignore. Nick exhaled slowly, his expression softening, as he lowered his voice, telling me he was terrified of losing me again, but that he also had to learn to trust in my strength and determination. I saw in his eyes a mixture of anger and fear, the need to protect, and the deeper fear of losing me for good. The anger inside me eased a little, replaced by a painful understanding, by fear, by pride. I knew this was a defining moment, a moment where we had to look directly at one another, at our fears, at our love, at trust that had been shattered and was now trying to rebuild. We stood there in the pale afternoon light, rain still falling softly outside, and even though my heart still beat fast, I realized I was ready to face his world, but on my terms, without control or confinement, and if he couldn't accept that, I would walk away. Nick looked at me, his eyes slowly softening, a faint tentative smile, appearing as if he were accepting the challenge, learning for the first time how to trust me fully. And for the first time, I saw the man behind the power, and the fury, the real man he had never shown to anyone else. I slipped back into the room after our tense argument, and Nick's voice came softer this time, his eyes shaded with regret, carrying a depth that struck something raw inside me. He apologized, not with poetic promises or grand gestures, but with a sincerity so bare it made my heart ache. He told me I had the right to choose everything, whether to stay by his side or walk away, how I wished to step into the complicated life he was running, and the role I wanted to hold in the shadows he commanded. When I looked at him, I no longer saw only the man who ruled Chicago with an iron certainty. I saw someone terrified of losing me, someone afraid that his own decisions might be the very thing that hurt me most. I exhaled slowly, weighed down by thought. If I chose to stay, I needed to understand his world, to adapt to the network of power, unspoken laws, and ever-present threats woven through his life. I met his gaze and told him firmly that I wanted to learn, that I wanted to understand everything, that I needed to know how to protect myself, so I could walk beside him without becoming a burden. He fell silent for a moment, then nodded, an expression flickering across his face that was part worry, part pride. He said Rosa would teach me. She was the only one he trusted to keep me alive. Rosa arrived the next day, entering the mansion not with the polite deference of a guest, but with the cold, assessing stare of a general inspecting fresh troops. She didn't bring binders of alliances or maps of the city's underground. She walked straight into the library, where Nick stood tensely by the window, and slammed a heavy black Glock onto the antique mahogany table. The sound echoed like a gunshot, sharp and violent, making me flinch. "Forget the politics," Rosa said, her voice raspy and devoid of sympathy. "Politics is for people who are guaranteed to wake up tomorrow. You are not." She slid the weapon across the polished wood until it stopped inches from my hand. It looked alien amongst the books and warm decor, a piece of cold death invading my sanctuary. "Pick it up." I hesitated, looking at Nick. He started to step forward, his jaw clenched. "Rosa, she doesn't need to." She needs to survive. Rosa snapped, cutting him off with a glare that actually made him pause. She turned back to me, her eyes blazing. If they come for you again, Claire, they won't ask you about trade routes. They will put a bullet in you. Or worse, they will use you to make him bleed. She pointed a finger at Nick. So tell me, if he is down, if the enemy is at the door, do you scream? Do you cry? Or do you end the threat? My hand trembled as I reached out. The metal was terrifyingly cold and heavier than I imagined. You hold it like a paintbrush, Rosa scoffed, stepping into my space, correcting my grip with bruising force. This is not for creating, it is for destroying. Learn the difference. That was how the week passed. It wasn't a classroom, it was a dismantling of who I used to be. Rosa didn't just teach me to shoot, she taught me to see the world through the eyes of a target. We spent hours walking through the mansion. She showed me that a window wasn't just a source of light, but a sniper's line of sight. A hallway wasn't just a passage, but a fatal funnel. She taught me how to memorize a room in 3 seconds, how to spot a tail in a shop window's reflection, and where to strike a man if I had nothing but my keys. Every lesson was a small trauma chipping away at the soft, artistic girl I had been for 27 years. My hands, once stained only with charcoal and pastel, were now smelling of gun oil and lead. My shoulders ached from the recoil, and my mind was exhausted from the constant state of hyper-awareness Rosa demanded. Nick watched it all from the shadows of the room, rarely interfering, though I saw the torment in his eyes. He hated this. He hated seeing the woman he loved being hardened by the very violence he had tried to shield her from. He looked at my bruised knuckles with a mixture of fierce pride and utter heartbreak, mourning the innocence I was losing with every magazine I loaded. By the 5th night, the transformation had taken root. I sat on the floor of the library, stripping the Glock and reassembling it with practiced mechanical movements, my eyes dry and focused. Rosa watched me for a long moment, then nodded once, a silent, grim seal of approval, before walking out without a word. The room fell silent. Nick came to me, then kneeling on the floor. He gently took the weapon from my hands, setting it aside as if it were poison, and took my calloused hands in his. He brought them to his lips, kissing the rough spots where the grip had dug in. "I never wanted this for you," he whispered, his voice rough with regret. "I wanted to give you the world, not a weapon." I looked at him, feeling a strange, cold clarity settle in my chest. "I know," I replied, my voice steady. "But I can't be just the girl you love anymore, Nick. If I am going to stay, I have to be the woman who survives with you." That afternoon, as the soft autumn sunlight washed gently over the garden behind the mansion, the place where we had talked for the first time after so many years apart, Nick held my hand and guided me along the stone pathways, past the carefully trimmed bushes that breathed a faint sweetness into the cooling air. My heart raced, a tangle of nerves and anticipation, as I watched him look around the garden with a tenderness that carried memories of laughter and confessions we once shared there. He stopped in the center of the garden, turned toward me, and in his eyes was everything he had never fully spoken: love, remorse, the fierce determination that had driven him to protect me through 7 long years. Then he did something that made my breath catch. He sank to one knee and drew a small box from his pocket. My heart seemed to stop, as I saw the ring inside the ring that had belonged to his mother, carrying not just the legacy of his family, but its love. Nick opened the box, his gaze never leaving mine, his voice low and steady, each word striking deep. He had built an entire kingdom, not only to hold power, but to be strong enough to shield me from every possible danger, to give me a life worthy of safety and dignity. His words unfolded slowly, carving themselves into my chest, powerful and tender at once. He asked me to be his queen, his voice firm, yet full of devotion, his eyes burning with a longing I had never seen in anyone, not even when we were young. Tears slipped down my face, unstoppable, carrying the weight of happiness, shock, and bittersweet emotion. My heart stretched so tight it almost hurt. I felt the force of his protection, the depth of his respect, the enormity of what he was offering. I lowered my head, lifted my hand, placed it in his, nodded through tears, my voice breaking as I accepted not merely as his lover, but as his partner, the one who would walk beside him through every burden and joy, through the light and the shadow. Nick pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly, his gaze blazing as though he wanted to pour the entire world into my heart, and I felt once again, but deeper than 7 years before, that this was where I belonged. We had found our way back through storms and darkness, and now we stepped into a new chapter, one built on trust, fierce love, and the choice to build a future together, despite the danger and power surrounding us. When he slipped the ring onto my finger, my heart knew with absolute certainty that no fear, no doubt, no shadow could break us again, could. 6 months had passed since that moment, and Claire now lived in the grand mansion beside Nick, though her life was no longer confined to the luxurious walls and the vast power he commanded. She spent most of her days teaching art to children at a center funded by Nick, a place where she nurtured their creativity and joy, and in turn found her own sense of balance. Each time she watched her young students laugh, each time she saw them lose themselves in the colors of their drawings, she realized her world had become a quiet blend of light and shadow, of power and love, of responsibility and happiness. Nick still ruled Chicago with an iron hand, controlling everything in the underworld with stern discipline and unwavering authority. Yet when he turned toward Claire, his eyes and gestures softened, protective and gentle, holding her heart as if with bare hands, tender but unshakably firm. Claire often reminded herself that what bound them was not only emotion, but a choice, an act of walking beside each other, understanding each other, and embracing both the bright and the dark parts of who they were. Through their story, we are reminded that love is not always perfect, nor is it always easy. But when two people cherish one another, protect what they have, and recognize each other's worth, they can find light even in the thickest shadows and the strength to endure every trial that life sets before them. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like and share, so you won't miss the meaningful videos we bring every day, and leave your thoughts in the comments so we can hear your honest feelings, those that come from deep within, and see how this story reflects your own life. Thank you for spending your time with us today. May you who are watching this video stay healthy, live joyfully, and find peace and renewed energy in each new day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.